Welcome to Perfume on the Radio. This is a bi-monthly program presented by the Institute for Art and Olfaction, a nonprofit based here in Los Angeles, California, where the people are beautiful and the smells are plentiful. My name is Saskia Wilson-Brown, and I'll be hosting today's episode. Because of COVID, we've had to record this episode with the tools at hand, and for that reason, the audio is not as stellar as we'd love it to be. But, we'll get better. In this episode, we're going to explore how scent relates to social structures. The episode was originally going to be an hour, but as we unpacked the narratives around scent and status and luxury, we found that there was just so much to say, and so we decided to make it a two-part episode. We humans sure love to polarize ourselves, and so we often tend to think of things in the context of a duality, God versus Satan, good versus bad, etc. And it's no different when it comes to class. We think of, for instance, luxury versus poverty, inclusion versus exclusion, high class versus working class. In the field of perfumery, the focus has always been on the upper echelons of this duality. Through time and space, perfumery has been, for the wealthy, used either consciously or unconsciously as a tool to signify status. And across cultures, you see the same stories repeated over and over again. Powerful, desirable people use the most exclusive materials and are described as pleasantly aromatic. The powerless, the unappreciated, the poor use whatever is at hand and are associated with malodor. This unjust and, yes, classist narrative comes up a lot. And lest you think we've progressed, have a little look at today's perfume ads. In this session, we've invited some pretty fascinating people to discuss and dismantle this classism in perfumery. First up is PhD candidate Robyn Price discussing the relationship between scent and class structures in ancient Egypt. After Robyn, I will share some of my own research, and I'll be followed by the wonderful artist Sarah Baker, fashion designer Jake Treddenick, and museum professional Jessica Murphy discussing the visuals of class structures and luxury in scent. We will then be joined by academic Nuri McBride discussing olfactory xenophobia and close out the episode with perfume reviewer Miya from Fab Trends by Miya speaking about the tropes of luxury. You're listening to Perfume on the Radio, Episode 2, Questions of Class. I am your host, Saskia Wilson-Brown, and let's get started. Robyn Price is a PhD candidate in the Cotson Institute of Archaeology at the University of California, Los Angeles. She has participated in archaeological excavations in many countries, including Cyprus, Israel, Spain, Egypt, Ethiopia, and here in the US. I started our conversation asking her about how the ancient Egyptians related to scent and class. Here's what she had to say.
It's quite a big question, actually. But what I've kind of come across in my research so far is that, like everything else when it comes to culture, things change over time. So we see scent in the earliest periods of Egyptian history cropping up mostly in royal tombs, where they're importing goods from as far away as the Levant, which is modern-day Syria-Palestine, all the way down into Punt, which is thought to be in the area around Eritrea, Ethiopia. And they're bringing in these scented products like raw materials for incense, but also manufactured oils and wood barks, and including them in their burials in large quantities, which is quite impressive for these earliest periods. And we see maybe a few hundred years later in the pyramid texts, when these religious texts start getting written down, that the scented materials that were being included in these tombs perhaps have this kind of religious ideological significance, where you want to smell like the gods in order for you to be accepted among them once you pass on to the next world. We see later in Egyptian history moving out of the Old Kingdom, which is like the Pyramid Age, into the Middle Kingdom and then the New Kingdom, these later periods of centralized rule, where these scented products seem to be migrating beyond just this elite or royal context into the more everyday experience of the ancient Egyptians. Now, of course, a lot of these products seem to have been controlled in the trade. So not everybody would have had access to Chanel No. 5 or the fanciest perfume you can think of. But there were local products that could be used, like papyrus. But no coniferous woods are native to Egypt. So people wanted these really high quality, expensive imported scented products, but they probably didn't have a lot of access to it if they weren't higher up on the social ladder.
So the coniferous woods would have been the equivalent of whatever, a high-end perfume?
Absolutely. So basically anything that had to be imported from great distances had this kind of luxury value established or connected with it.
Was there any sort of ancient Egyptian equivalent to marketing? I mean, we have things that are of value because we're sort of, there's the naturals that are expensive, but there's also a lot of things that we're told are valuable and therefore are valuable. Did it work in that way in ancient Egypt as well, or was it a little more linked to actual supply and demand and trade?
So that's a really interesting question that a lot of us are trying to get at, but it's not perfectly clear. It does seem by the later period, so we're talking about the New Kingdom, so after 1550 BCE, and especially into the 4th century, that the marketing seems to have been a part of the trading network. So they used these really fancy, really beautiful jars to put these scented oils in, and we find these products all over the Mediterranean. So not only does it give us an idea of where these products are coming from, so for example, a Mycenaean stirrup jar would most likely originate in Mycenae, but it might have had this kind of marketing edge where it's like, oh, look at this fancy jar I have, you know what's inside of it because it's recognizable.
I know that a massive part of your research relates to the association between scent and the gods. Do you think that relationship played a part in class perceptions in ancient Egypt?
Yeah. So one of the things that I've always questioned is why create an industry centered around a product that is so scarce? And one of the things that I've come upon is this idea that because it's scarce, it's easier to control. And so it's easier to establish and maintain a higher position in the social hierarchy. Just like we can think about iPhones today, right? People line up around the block to get the newest iPhone drop, but not everybody can afford one. It's almost like a necessity to be a middle-class American. You have to have an iPhone. And I feel like the Egyptian scent industry followed a similar kind of ideal where these were luxury goods, but they were also seen as a necessary part of life. And I think that is probably built around or is maybe reified by this connection with the divine. I think that idea, that ideology is tied in with this idea of social relationships and establishing this hierarchy of status among the ancient Egyptians.
So something that I find really fascinating is that when the Romans took over Egypt, and I think it was like 45 or 50 BC, there was this public discourse among the Romans that scent, perfume was associated with a slightly lesser type of person. And this was linked strongly to Egyptians and also, of course, to the Greeks. Do you have any thoughts on this?
So this is actually something that I want to pursue, after I get the dissertation out. So I think it's actually a really great question. Egypt became a center in the Coptic period for monks becoming ascetics, where you kind of give up everything and you wear the same piece of clothing and you stay in a little stone cell and you separate yourself from everything. And that's kind of the complete opposite of Greek and ancient Egyptian lifestyles, where they really held up this idea of carpe diem, have a great time because you're only going to be around for, a short period of time. If you're lucky, maybe 40 years, maybe 50, more likely less than that. And you should enjoy it while you're alive. So drink, have a lot of good times, right? The ancient Egyptians had this phrase, heru nefer, which is like, have a holiday, have a good time. So they threw a lot of banquets, they had a lot of sex.
And scent played into that. Scent was part of that sort of loving life, right?
Exactly. So when you went to a banquet, you got all dolled up with all of your scented oils and you had your unguents and you scented your linens and you went out and had a good time with your friends and family. And the Greeks did this also. And this isn't proven, right? I haven't done this research yet, but it seems like with the advent of monotheism during the Roman period, this kind of overindulgence gets stigmatized. I'm not totally sure if the polytheistic Romans embodied this idea of shutting down the indulgence, but definitely early Christianity does seem to have pushed back against this, using lots of incense, wearing lots of scented oils. There's a text from the Greek period. It's Pliny the Elder. He talks about perfumes being the most superfluous form of luxury. He talks about how these emperors like Caligula scented their bathtubs and they just kind of went over and above. And it doesn't make any sense because when you put perfume on, you forget that you're wearing it after a while, right? You become adjusted to the scent. So really, what is the point of scenting yourself? You should want to scent the people around you. And he likens this to a really interesting idea that connects back to ancient Egypt, where he says he thinks that the empire was actually conquered through the gifting of perfumes to soldiers, which is really interesting because the ancient Egyptians also had this policy of gifting soldiers perfumes.
What kind of perfumes would they have been gifting, or does it get that detailed?
So the Pliny the Elder doesn't talk about it. The ancient Egyptians also, the difficulty with ancient Egyptian recipes is that we don't have all the scientific designations of the Egyptian words. It can be really difficult to equate these things. So if we see the word senecher, which is one of the most common words used for incense in ancient Egypt, not only was it used for over 3,000 years, so the meaning likely changed, or at least varied based on context. We also, how are we supposed to connect the word senecher with a product that we're familiar with today, right? Is it myrrh? Is it frankincense? Is it pistacia resin? Is it all of these things, depending on where it's used? So identifying recipes in the Egyptian context is very difficult, though by the Greek and Roman periods, they do start writing down some recipes for us. So you might have heard of the Mendesian or Kifi. So these recipes get written down much later in Egyptian history.
That was Robyn Price, a PhD candidate at UCLA, exploring the relationship between scent and power in ancient Egypt. As Robyn touched on, the history of scent is riddled with stories of beautiful and sometimes rare aromatics being associated with powerful people. Some examples among many include the Mesopotamian Epic of Gilgamesh, written in about 2000 BC, where Gilgamesh says, "I arranged 7 and 7 cult vessels. I heaped reeds, cedar, and myrtle in their perfume burners. The gods smelled the sweet savor. The gods crowded round the sacrificer like flies." About 1,000 years later, a Babylonian Mesopotamian tablet tells the story of Taputi Belatekalim. Taputi was an overseer of the palace who used flowers and woods to create aromatics for the noble residents. In the Han Dynasty in China, from about 206 BC to AD 220, materials like sandalwood, camphor, and frankincense were ground into what the Han scholar Cheng Xuan described as a paste. Later, Buddhists adopted incense as a way of communicating with the deities and purifying the temples. Meanwhile, in Rome, Nero was said to shower his guests with rose petals during his feasts and allegedly used a year's budget worth of incense for his wife Poppaea's funeral. That is, after allegedly kicking her to death. Not to be outdone, Emperor Constantine, when he moved the Roman and now Christian capital to modern-day Istanbul, decreed massive budgets for aromatics to be strewn along the paths of his royal parades and to be dispersed into his new Christian churches. Later, in early Islam, scent was embraced by the Prophet himself, with his wife Aisha testifying of his habit of being anointed with musk until his beard and skin were shiny. As these examples show us, scent has long been associated with powerful people and with gods, and in no coincidence with powerful people who wished to be associated with gods. Let's fast forward to 17th century France and yet another powerful ruler. Louis XIV was a grandiose king. He believed that he was the incarnation of the glory of France and that his power was God-given. He was also a very energetic ruler, taking a firm hand in every aspect of state and trade. Meticulous in his presentation and in court formalities, his love of perfumery was so extravagant that it was said to have led to a sort of allergy by the end of his life. Before his allergies manifested, however, he supported the aromatic producers in the south of France. He did this in the hopes of controlling trade, and in so doing, he set the stage for the modern European perfume industry. Louis XIV was followed by Louis XV and his perfumed court, where perfume signified class to such a degree that the king's low-born mistress, Madame de Pompadour, was often spoken of on unflattering olfactory terms called poissonnades. I think the translation of that would be more or less fish verses. It was during Louis XV's reign also that M. de Jean wrote a book called Le Traité des Odeurs, or the Treaty of Odors, which explained perfumery as an art whose primary purpose was to create beauty for a discerning audience. Perfumery was cemented as an art form for the noble, and this association continued in Louis XV's court, where the consumption of aromatics was so extravagant that foreign-born courtiers complained about the bizarre odors of the salons. With this strong link between perfumery and the nobility, and between malodor and the lower classes, it is no surprise that when the French Revolution seethed to life in 1789, the perfumers paid a hefty price. The Perfumers Guild was abolished in 1791, and those perfumers who didn't fall victim to the terror were forced to flee, expanding the reputation of French perfumery amongst the upper classes in other countries of Europe, while continuing the cultural narrative associating pleasant smells with the elite. So let's talk a little bit about some perfume formulas from the reign of Louis XIV and Louis XV. In a wonderful book called The Royal Perfumer, or Le Parfumeur Royal, published in 1699, perfumer Simon Barbe lists formulations for aromatic compositions for all number of applications. As the title suggests, these formulas were written for the nobility, and the book itself was dedicated to the son of Louis XIV and his wife Marie-Thérèse. His famous Thousand Flowers formula states that, and this is a direct translation, the essence and oil of 1,000 flowers is made by mixing the essences or oils of all manner of aromatic flowers together while making sure that no one flower aroma dominates another. The perfumer doesn't specify quantities, but his recommended flowers include violet, hyacinth, narcissus, orange blossom, rose, tuberose, and jasmine. He also mentions something called cassis, which I think might be an outdated spelling of cassis. This is known as blackcurrant to English speakers. To some people it smells like juicy, fruity deliciousness. To others it smells bang on the money for cat pee. From a book published 65 years later during the reign of Louis XV, Antoine Arnaud, otherwise known as M. de Jean, shares another famous recipe. The combination of rosemary buds, rosemary leaves, thyme, lavender, costus, marjoram, sage, and a few other herbal materials. To prepare the perfume, he suggests grinding these materials together with a mortar and pestle and mixing them into a measure of high-quality wine spirits. The result is a perfume so lovely that it was said to have made the octogenarian Elizabeth of Pologne beautiful enough to seduce the King of Hungary, hence the name Eau de la Reine d'Hongrie, more commonly known as Hungary water. Our next guest, Sarah Baker, has been working with the aesthetics of class since she was a young artist in San Francisco. When I first met her in 2001 in London, she was inhabiting high fashion aesthetics with large photographic works. In 2015, she launched her perfume line Sarah Baker Perfumes, and last year produced a photographic book with Versace called Baroness. Here she is talking about class structures in her practice.
I've been, fooling around with the idea of class and taste and aspiration, celebrity, and bringing all these things together and heightened narrative dramas in my practice since I can remember. When I moved to London in particular, it was really an interesting shift to see what class structure was like in British society compared to American society, because it's extraordinarily different.
You're originally from upstate New York, right?
Well, I grew up in Rust Belt, Buffalo, so it's kind of like an impoverished city. Always dreamed of moving back to San Francisco, where I was born. And then I did live there, which is when I kind of started making work about class, because San Francisco is so rich compared to Buffalo. And that rich has a very specific aesthetic, which really excited me. When I moved to London, it was like the class structures in the UK are completely different from how they are in the US, because there really are royalty here, the Queen and the royal family and the aristocrats. The middle class is not the same in the UK as it is in the US. So that was a kind of an awakening for me. And I was making work about it. So I was doing a lot of film and video. And after I made a film about the torrid true story of Gucci, where for legal reasons I had to change the name and then the branding, and I had to create my own brand for the film, the clothing, the logo, the jewelry, the furniture, the homewares. After that, I really wanted to depart from the realm of narrative fiction and to create something real for people to really interact with, like a real product. And I also wanted to tell stories with scent. So I kind of shifted a little bit away from just the visual, and I moved into perfumery.
So how do you do that? How do you transition the visuals of class structures into scent? How do you interpret wealth and class in perfumery?
So when I first started the brand and thinking about the visual signifiers, perfumery has this real shtick about making things, like look like they're fit for a king or a queen. And a lot of the packaging actually does that, like black and gold is shorthand for luxury products and luxury perfume. And that is definitely a trap that I fell into with my first packaging. But when it came down to it, I just kind of ran out of the energy to reiterate this royalty signifier because I felt like that is an outdated system of hierarchy that I didn't really want to participate in. And those were values that were not really actually important to me anymore. So basically, like I sort of shifted my priorities and kind of made things that were more meaningful, like excitement, playfulness, delightfulness. Those are the things that are important to me, not making something fit for a king or queen. Like, what is that?
Certainly there was a shift for you, just in your packaging alone, like you said, from the sort of black and gold to this new package design that you've more recently unveiled, which is, it's like this beautiful orange inspired, I think, by the Golden Gate Bridge. And a big, bold graphic circle, as a label. And it's definitely, it's lighter. It feels lighter,
Well, and the logo is actually directly inspired by an amusement park that my father used to work in called Crystal Beach, because it was such a joyful time for me to be able to visit Crystal Beach when I was a kid. And that excitement and joyfulness and delightfulness, and those were the things that I wanted to bring into the brand, and not, not like the visual signifiers of money, like, and the visual signifiers of class and status. It was like, I just wanted to shift away from that. Yeah. But in terms of the fragrances themselves, what I find is really interesting is that I don't know exactly what this is, but sometimes I hear people say things like, this smells really expensive. Definitely, I have heard people say that about Bascule, made by Ashley Eden Kessler. And I find it really interesting because we actually designed Bascule, which was originally called Equestrian. And the sort of whole idea around Equestrian was like horse motif. So it's kind of like the Gucci Hermes, motif of like a Gucci scarf, the saddles and the stirrups from the horses and stuff like that. But then through my research, I discovered Charlotte Casiraghi, a real princess of Monaco. And she's this gorgeous princess who, just like perfect princess hair, perfect princess skin. She's a model. She's a Gucci model. And she's an equestrian champion. Like, she's actually a competitive equestrian horse rider. And so she just fascinated me. So Ashley and I were working together about, I was sending her loads of pictures of Charlotte Casiraghi. And Ashley had access to horse stables, and she had access to a mint condition classic Rolls Royce. And Ashley is really technical at replicating fragrances. And so when she had access to this Rolls Royce, this mint condition, plush leather, cream interior, that was the leather accord that is running through Bascule. So when people say to me, it's Bascule smells expensive, I think, well, yeah, those were the ideas that kind of were running through the entire composition.
On the topic of displays of wealth, a place we visited together, Sarah, and enjoyed and laughed about in equal measure was the 6th floor at Harrods, which is a secluded space entirely devoted to perfume that just blinds you with sparkly gold and, signifiers of royalty with crowns and diamante and all that stuff. And basically it lets you know at all occasions that this is an exclusive space for wealthy people. But at the same time, it sort of falls strangely flat. Like, it doesn't feel exclusive to me, at least, So if these fancy displays of money and wealth don't always function as proper signifiers of class, then what does signify class?
It might actually be a title. I mean, or an education in the UK. But titles can be bought. Like, for instance, Baron and Baroness is it's like the lower echelons of titles. that's what kind of Versace is all about. And also accessibility. So, for $300, if you wanted to buy a t-shirt, you can get that taste of that Versace royalty, even for less if you buy it used on eBay. Of the perfume, like Versace Bright Crystal, I think you could probably get that for like $40, $45. And so it gives you access to this idea of luxury and wealth.
And that accessibility is okay, right? I mean, I always come to the fact that we always have a right to enjoy what we enjoy.
Oh, totally. I mean, ultimately, I think what I've just kind of come to starting to realize is like, I don't need that. I don't need that access to, that feeling of feeling royal. I mean, I feel like as a society, maybe we're starting to get over that because class structures actually don't work. So, when you say, oh, I worked really hard for where I got today, well, maybe you were born into a certain race, you were born into a certain class already, and that helped. So, yeah, of course it's okay to get that little piece of wanting to feel luxurious. But, at the same time, why are we aspiring to get to the kings and the queens and the crowns? What is that?
So how do you square all this away with perfumery?
For me, it is a very conflicting proposition. Here I am. I have, I guess, a luxury perfume brand, yet I'm extremely conflicted by the notions of status and hierarchy. I don't think that is necessarily a good system that we should be perpetuating. So it's very conflicting. But at the same time, as an artist, I really want to continue to make work. And also, what is extremely gratifying to me is that I don't need to sell my work to Charles Saatchi or to Anita Zembladovich or, whatever super uber rich person in the art world that you would rely on to collect your work. Whereas my products are, I think, $220 and less. So you can have this as a piece of work. And, for $95, a bascule, you can own that. It all is an experience and it smells good and you can use it and you can own it. So for me, that is extremely gratifying.
That was London-based Sarah Baker, an artist and the owner and creative director of Sarah Baker Perfumes.
You're listening to Perfume on the Radio.
On lookout,
Jake Treddenick is a recent graduate of the Royal College of Art MA Fashion program in London. His work explores the class structures of English society, drawing from his own upbringing first in a middle class and then in a working class family in the north of England. Here's Jake talking about class.
All this stuff with kind of race and everything going on at the moment, a lot of the times when people are talking about it, I feel like it's very rooted still in class. When I'm working, I'm definitely picking into that history. The reason I use white fabric was because actually in working class situations, they try and keep things as white and clean as possible because they think that's more luxurious. And you sometimes associate these kind of country bumpkin upper class people with like muddy shoes, and they don't really care because for them it's maybe about the way you act in a social situation rather than how clean your trainers are. I realized ultimately no matter what class you're in, you're kind of defined by your family, and the family's history and heritage, because it's from an older period, is kind of defined by class.
So Jake, how does that manifest in your family?
When I come up home, it's all about food. You've got to feed everyone and make sure everyone's full. And you're eating like a lot of butter and a lot of carbs, but it's fine because you're full. And if your plate's empty, they're like, well, give them more food, give them more food. My flatmate, who's from a very middle class situation, and he, for him, it's sort of about the right type of rice to eat, and it's about kind of the right grain. And I think when it comes to clothing, it kind of relates because, for example, someone from a middle class situation might be interested in the fact the wool is, it's merino wool, and merino wool is better quality, and it's a softer and it's more of a touch, where like my aunt today was talking to me about a jumper and I was like, it's acrylic. And she's like, no, it's not, it's wool. And I was like, no, it's acrylic. She might not look at that, for example, when she's shopping. In terms of fashion, you have different approaches to sort of how you consume. And I mean, someone was talking to me and they were like, Primark is becoming expensive now. And then for some reason today it popped in my head. The reason it's become more expensive is because they've taxed clothing production within the UK. So every time you buy something, it's got an extra penny added to it. However, if you went to Balenciaga and you have the same polyester material making a dress, they wouldn't tax them because it seems luxury because of the way it's made. If it's the same material, that doesn't make any sense.
What's the difference? Yeah, well, then but that gets into class perception, right? It's all about the Balenciaga context.
Yeah. And that's what I think I've realized, the luxury element. It's something, it's a lot of it to do with like care and the relationship you have with a customer. And actually, you could sell someone anything, but I think those added bits, the packaging and the tiny detail that you don't think about are sort of stuff that make it luxurious. But again, I think if you're from a working class situation, you might not think about that because you don't understand.
So you were doing a project when I first met you at the Royal College of Art in London called Class F, and we're calling it Class F because the actual name of it is not FCC safe, but it's rhymes with duck. It's a word that rhymes with duck and starts with an F. So now in Class F, you were wanting to examine scent from the perspective of class and in a very uniquely, English context because, you're in England.
Yeah, because I think class is always associated with Britishness, and I kind of liked the way scent helped me link to memories, which then helped me look at class from my perspective, and then how scent had kind of influenced me without knowing. And I think that's kind of what I found interesting was the imagery of scent portrayed this certain vision, which is kind of aspirational, but actually anyone could buy that and anyone could access it. And they had no control over who that was. And someone buying a bottle of Chanel probably didn't look like the Chanel girl for that season, but they wore it and they felt fabulous.
Right.
I think there's something I spoke about I remember speaking to you about with opium. My grandma wearing opium, and I always remember her spraying it on and this kind of opulence. You could see she sort of stood a bit taller, and she had like these crazy tops on, which when I was looking into opium, you could kind of see that linked in some way.
Are there any scents that you sort of associate with different classes?
For some reason with me, I always associate there's like I call it like an old people smell. And I always associate it with working class because it's sort of like when you put your hat on and your hat's a bit sweaty and it's a bit feisty. My family, they come from coal miners. I remember once we went to my great granddad's house and he had a coal fire, and that kind of really strong smell linked with things like bread and these like stodgy salted butters. And then, for example, going to a museum or something else, it smelled completely different. I love going to the V&A, and I think the V&A smells amazing. It's got like this oaky, woody smell, and I just found it, because that was built for opulence, right? That was built for art. That was built to show off to people. I would never know what the Queen smelled like, but then the Queen would never know what it would be like to sit in like a working class miner's house.
What do you think the Queen would smell like?
I think she would smell like kind of a chalky makeup, because she does wear a lot of makeup. I think you'd have that kind of powdery smell that came from the makeup, maybe a bit floral.
Yeah, like a light violet. When we met, in London, we had talked a little bit about fabrics and the different sort of class associations with fabric. Do you mind elucidating a little bit?
Yeah, so I mean, wool has a very distinctive smell, and a lot of upper class people would wear wool because it is a luxury product. And then you might have these kind of like a white cotton that has no scent at all. Fabric is kind of the first thing we would probably see on someone. It's a little bit like I'm saying with my grandma and her crazy clothes. You would think the top she had with like 1 million sequins on would be more expensive than a wool jacket, but actually that's not the case. Fabric, because it's an image, I didn't realize when you touch it, you get a completely different understanding of the person. So actually, when it was saying scent is the first decision you make on someone from a class background, but actually image is kind of a really key part in that. I think I've realized it's such an interest for me that the collection might not be about it, but it's something that I will always question in life. Unfortunately, political kind of things that are going on now as well, it really does affect you. There are people out there who have to make a choice between a tin of beans and a meter of fabric. And I think someone doesn't understand that, they are not from a working class situation.
That was London-based fashion designer Jake Treddenick telling us about how he relates scent to fashion and fashion to class. Our next guest, Jessica Murphy, is an art historian and museum professional with a passion for perfume. She also does quite a bit of writing, and you could find her online as Perfume Professor. Jessica, welcome to Perfume on the Radio.
Saskia, thank you. It is such a pleasure to chat with you today.
Yeah, well, likewise. So I think I'll just ask you the straightforward question, which is when it comes to signifying luxury and, class, perfume bottles are the first order of business for many companies. So how would you say that perfume bottles have signified class?
Well, I am so interested in perfume bottles. I love any point where the olfactory and the visual intersect. I should also say that I've worked in museums for a while, including a museum on Manhattan's Upper East Side, which is a very upscale neighborhood. There's a very dense concentration of wealth. It's a very class-conscious neighborhood, and working in it for over a decade, I became more and more aware of it. That was also the time I was thinking more and more seriously about perfume. So I think some of my thinking about perfume bottles as signifiers of luxury comes out of all the time I spent perfume shopping in that neighborhood. And even if you look at the people on the Upper East Side, it sort of breaks down into different presentations. So there's certainly people who are into very conspicuous consumption, people who might wear multiple logos at a time on their sunglasses and their watch and their shoes and their handbag and whatnot. And that is something that's designed to catch the eye and communicate very directly and boldly that a lot of money was spent for the acquisition and consumption of those goods. And I think there are some perfume bottles that fall into that category. Perfume bottles from the earliest days, 4,000 years ago, were usually made out of precious materials to hold the precious materials that the fragrances themselves were. So there have been for a long time very flashy bottles that are almost like people wearing important jewelry or logos themselves. You see a lot of gold, a lot of reflective materials, a lot of metallic jewels. So I'm thinking of the Clive Christian bottles of the world, the Roja Doves, the Amouages, where a bottle will be studded sometimes with fake gems and with gilt materials. It's a very, very eye-catching, very explicit communication that money has been put into that bottle and that money has been spent to acquire that bottle. And those brands also happen to have pretty limited distribution. So there's a sense you've also gone out of your way to find them.
Are those brands typically quite expensive?
Yes. Even in the ever spiraling cycle of niche and prestige perfumes with prices going up and up, Roja Dove, Clive Christian, Amouage are always really at the top price-wise, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars, sometimes $1,000 or $2,000. I think Clive Christian at one point was very proud that they had the most expensive perfume on the market. And that was something that Patou's Joy was very proud of doing in the 1930s. But in this case, the price was really exorbitant. And I think Clive Christian also had a bottle at one point that had an actual diamond on it. And then there's the other way of displaying class through luxury. And it's much more private, much more exclusive in a sense that you have to know it to see it, that there are certain loafer brands or certain cashmere shawls or certain quilted jackets that don't really have obvious logos, but if you know them, you know them. One of my friends calls it stealth wealth, where the message is that the quality is what's important and the access to it, but you don't have to broadcast it to everybody else on the street. And there is some perfume packaging that reminds me of that in terms of expressing luxury and class. And you could even go back to Chanel No. 5 and their packaging, which was shockingly minimalist at the time, but the juice itself was such high quality. Frederic Malle, when his edition de Parfum came out around 2000, I think, the packaging looked really shockingly stark. Basically, the bottle had a very plain black cap, a very plain label, and the bottle was beautifully crafted when you held it and activated the atomizer, but it looked plain to uninitiated eyes. So that then becomes another way of communicating. It's what's inside that counts, and there's a flattering message that you, the consumer, are discerning, you're perceptive enough to realize that, and you're getting beyond surface appearances by choosing this fragrance with the plain white bottle and the plain black lettering and the simple cap, and no guilt, no jewels, no color, no illustration. Some brands will even have exclusive collections. For example, Dior or Prada will have mainstream fragrances, but their exclusive collection will have a simpler, more minimalist packaging that appeals again to that presumably more discerning customer who is able to spend $300 rather than $100 and appreciates that it's the quality of the perfume itself and not the flashiness of the package.
My husband's a typography designer, and there's this theory in type design called the crystal goblet theory. This idea that the type is there to convey the words and the meaning, not to impose itself. And to me, this feels like a sort of perfume design equivalent to that, where the bottle is, as you just said, there to sort of contain the real meaning of the purchase, which is the smell.
Oh, I've never heard that, but I like that. And then, of course, that's a much easier kind of packaging to knock off.
Right.
So then it has moved down into the Maison Margiela replicas and the commodity perfumes and other things available at Sephora that have knocked off that concept of exclusivity and discernment at a lower price point.
Could you quickly define the difference between prestige, niche, and mass market in the fragrance world?
There's some overlap. I think mass market is probably the simplest. It's the most widely available. It's the most affordable. So in a way, that's more clear cut, something you can get at drugstores, large chain department stores, places that don't necessarily only sell fragrance. So the access to mainstream mass market fragrances is the easiest. Then prestige, I think, is really an industry term, really primarily based on price. I think around $180, $200 and up, with a more limited distribution. And then niche has overlapped a lot with prestige. I think 20, 15 years ago, it used to mean a smaller, more independent house or brand that was supposedly operating outside focus groups and trends and market research and taking a more artistic, creative approach to making fragrance. The fuzziness started to occur within the past decade when a multinational giant like Estee Lauder would then start to acquire the Frederic Malls and the Le Labos of the world. So now a niche brand might be owned by a very, very large corporation, although not in all cases.
So let's talk a little bit about mass market or, quote, affordable perfumes.
That's a fun area and very different, I think, than the area that's communicating large income, high status luxury. And the motivations do seem to be different. On the one hand, there are perfumes that are really being marketed as body sprays. I'm thinking of the Bath and Body Works body sprays or the Axe or Lynx body sprays, things that are meant to be used lavishly and sprayed all over because they are very affordable. And they're really in a gray area between functional product and fragrance. And then there are perfumes that almost seem to be edging further and further towards that territory. And the bottles almost seem slightly functional and plain, but not in an elegant, minimal way, more in a body spray way. I think I'm thinking of Clinique Happy or Dolce & Gabbana Light Blue, and these are perennial bestsellers as far as I can tell. That seems to be one area. And then there's this whole host of perfume bottles that are designed to look like anything but a perfume bottle. And they can be fun, and they can be very clever, and they can be a little over the top. I'm thinking of, Katy Perry did a cat-shaped bottle. Diesel does a sort of fist-shaped bottle, and Azzaro does one that's unfortunately shaped like the barrel of a gun. Carolina Herrera does a shoe, a stiletto heel with a ridiculously high heel for Good Girl. And Marc Jacobs does Decadence in a bottle shaped like a handbag. People have been creating figurative bottles for perfumes since ancient Egypt and the ancient Near East. There are bottles shaped like animals and people, and they often had sacred meanings in the shapes and designs that they chose. These figurative bottles, I'm not exactly sure what's going on there. I sometimes feel like you're being convinced you're buying something that isn't even perfume, that you really are buying the bottle and the perfume is almost a complete afterthought. Or perhaps this really explicit connection is being made between the Marc Jacobs handbag that you or I can't afford, but the perfume that you can. And there's some sort of connection or even substitution happening there, almost like an acknowledgement that you won't be buying Carolina Herrera clothing, but that you can definitely buy the Good Girl perfume bottle. And there are bottles that are just definitely very logo heavy, like Coach or Versace or Michael Kors. And I think that would be the mass market version of the the Roja Doves, where there is a lot of glitter and gold and fancy typefaces that do draw attention to themselves because you are meant to see the logo. And in that case, a brand like Michael Kors or Coach might not be as far out of reach as something like Carolina Herrera. Maybe you're a fan of the brand and that's why you're buying the perfume, but those are definitely bottles that are designed to catch the eye. So maybe there really isn't as much division here between the prestige and the mass market, that sometimes you do want something that's going to draw attention to itself and to your particular tastes, no matter what your income point. And then sometimes it's about the quality of what's inside, which still does seem to stick to the prestige niche. And sometimes you almost seem to be denying that you're buying perfume, and instead you're buying a cat or a shoe or a purse or a body spray.
It reminds me of the impulse to collect. I mean, I have it, I love buying little figures and, especially when I was a kid. So I could see how that could be appealing. My first perfumes were Avon perfumes in bottles shaped like a pig and a skunk and a little French girl wearing a beret. So that's adorable.
That age, you had them on, but I valued them more for the tactility and the visuals and just how they looked on my dresser or my shelf than anything. So I think that impulse, I still have that. I'm sure a lot of us still do have that as adults. So I don't want to discount that entirely. I'm just not always sure
what's going on.
Perfume fits into that bigger picture for some of these luxury brands selling you the figurative bottle.
Yeah, I totally get that. Well, Jessica, thank you so much for, sharing your research and insight into design, really, and perfumery and how that affects perceptions of class and luxury. It's really pretty fascinating stuff.
Thank you. It's such a complex topic that I'm still thinking about a lot. So thanks for this opportunity to unpack some of that.
That was Jessica Murphy. You can learn more about her work at perfumeprofessor.net. Our next guest is Nuri McBride. Nuri is an activist, a writer, a perfumer, and an academic. Her focus is on issues of death acceptance, olfactive cultural education, beauty culture, decolonizing social movements, intersectional feminism, and end-of-life care for marginalized people. She joined us from her home in Haifa, Israel. Well, so welcome, Nuri, and thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to start just right in with some questions. So my first one is, do you think that the advertising of perfumery supports narratives of class, structure, and exclusion?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. The language is language of elite and, bespoke and highbrow and sophisticated. You hear people talk about like, ooh, when I put on this scent, it made me smell rich. The idea that we have a smell of rich, the glorification of wealth. There's a fragrance called $1 million. I mean, the glorification of wealth is still very much a part of consumer products and perfumery. That is very much something very rooted in class and class structures.
So looking at sort of perfume advertisements, and I'm generalizing a bit, but I've done a little bit of research, you do notice a certain sort of trend, which is, the advertisements typically feature, white men and women, young, beautiful. And the idea is that this is sort of the face of the high class, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason why there's a lot of association with celebrity and with fashion houses, that these kind of go hand in hand, because this is if the fashion house is the aesthetic, the physical aesthetic of the high class, they're serving the upper class, then high-end fragrances are serving that as well on an olfactive level. Then there is pushback here and there, but it's very token, I think, at this point. But if you look at the bulk of advertising around fragrances, it's the Riviera, right? It's
totally.
People on yachts, and they're gorgeous, and they're wearing $100,000 worth of jewelry, and a $5,000 dress on, and the whole concept of especially kind of mid-tier designer fragrances is not that you're selling a juice so much as you're selling the fantasy of the brand. It's really about brand connection, and that's connected to the visuals of wealth and power that are associated with those brands.
And this is reinforcing, of course, class structures in society, isn't it?
It's saying that this is valuable and this isn't. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why it's so upsetting when you have cultural appropriation in these kinds of environments, either whether it was advertising in fashion and in perfumery, because if it's something denoting a community, a culture, a class that is looked down upon by the people who are part of it, but then if these rich people do it for a costume or for an advertisement to make themselves look edgy to sell a product, then it's cool. But it's not cool if the people who are, originate it wear it. And you see that very much in fragrance advertising as well.
Can you think of any recent examples of cultural appropriation to point to?
A recent one would be the ad campaign around Sauvage by Dior. So the 2019 campaign featuring Johnny Depp, it was, Johnny Depp in the American outback, and there's native people dancing, and he's presented as this he's presented as native. Essentially, he's like wearing an arape, and it was something that Indigenous people in the Americas were extremely upset about when it came out. The idea of this kind of wearing of native dress, native dance to sell a product called Savage.
The name alone.
So horrifically used against them. And I mean, I can't say to their credit, but they read the room very quickly and pulled that advertisement extremely quickly. Really, in this day and age, I don't think it's too much to think that people who are making these products really care about addressing their whole community that may be exposed to them. Maybe that's too much to ask, but at the very least, you can hire a sensitivity consultant who could maybe sit there and look at your products and say, hey, you know what, maybe having a non-native person dressing this way in this environment and talking about the savageness of man isn't a good idea. You can hire somebody to do that. That is a thing. Dior has the money. So
yeah, no, certainly they do. It does. It's funny. It's like they sort of read the Rousseau and then they kind of stopped there,
And that's really the small defense they sort of made for it. Kind of played on that. They're like, oh no, we're admiring them. We're admiring it, and it's like, yeah, but listen to it. Like, if native people are telling you it doesn't feel like admiring, then that should just be enough for you.
Yeah, no, totally.
It was a very weird campaign, and I think it lasted all of 3 days before they completely pulled it off, which, good for that. But, even in the kind of indie world, I mean, Gypsy Water still exists, and they've been called out on that name multiple times, but I don't think they're going to change it personally.
Is that Byredo?
Byredo, yeah. It's a beautiful fragrance, but the language around it, the copy is not great. Kind of making this this wandering bohemian just out there in the forest, just being great. It's like, they were horrifically abused.
That was Nuri McBride joining us from Haifa in Israel. You can find out more about her work at nurimcbride.com. And you'll hear more from Nuri in part 2 of our 2-part exploration of class and smell. Our final guest today is Miya from Fab Trends by Miya. Miya reviews perfume on her YouTube channel, and you can find her on Instagram at instagram.com/fabtrends. Miya joined us from lockdown at her home outside London.
I personally don't want to think about class. I'm very open, but I'm very aware. There's always been class. There will always be class. My personal experience, having mixed obviously with people from either class, the people from the middle class, they kind of look down on people maybe below them, whereas the upper class are more open to ideas, open to welcome other people in their circles.
Do you think different people have different perceptions of class?
I think so. I think people have different perceptions on class. And this is more important to certain individuals than other people. Some people are more concerned about who they are seen with, who they relate to. And this goes as well in where you live, where you shop. So people are categorizing people into classes depending on the things they do about their lives. So
Do you think that perfume plays into that by signifying sort of who should buy which perfume? Do you think perfume conveys a message, I guess is what I'm asking?
Oh, absolutely. 100% without a doubt. I have noticed, and I'm sure, I don't know about you, but I'm very aware there's a class in perfumery. You see it from certain brands. And even within even certain brands, they've got different classes of their fragrances for which market who they are trying to send out the message to who this is for. And we've seen this even with the likes of, say, for example, fashion houses like Dior, and you've got Chanel. So they've got their standard range, which everyone can buy from the high street. And they've got their exclusive range, which are not available on the high street. They're kind of in special boutiques. And that's, again, just putting a level like, okay, up to here, anyone can have this, but above here, this is for who this is. If you don't go out to Harrods, you can't have this fragrance because you are not going to get it, for example, in your local Boots or in your local Debenhams. We see this with brands even such as a good example, Roger Dove or even Elma Perfumes.
Yeah.
There is that in certain fragrances, therefore a certain audience. We see it in the presentation, in the pricing, and even in the way they price them, not having discounts, for example, because other brands are having discounts every so often. But when you go to Roger Dove, they never do discounts. And then the caps on their bottles, they're all jeweled. So they have an audience in mind. And that audience is definitely not for the lower class.
I got it. So are there any perfumes that you associate with the sense of being, say, high class? And how do you relate to that yourself?
I think for me, obviously, the price I've paid for a fragrance plays a part. And as well, how easy is it to access? And as well, how is the presentation? In my collection, I've got a few of the fragrances, for example, which are a Harrods exclusive. I treasure those because they have sold out. You can't get them now. And therefore, for me, those are like, oh my gosh, this is so exclusive. I can't even waste it. I need to look after it because I will not be able to find it again. Then there are other fragrances as well, like fragrances from Alej Redori, for example. Like he will release only a few bottles, and you are lucky if you get your hands on it. I mean, I wasn't even lucky enough to get my hand on one of the fragrances I wanted from the last collection. I believe it's all just marketing, and I'm trying to be a very conscious consumer and not enable myself to fall into that trap. I know deep down for a lot of these fragrances, in as much as they may come in a fancy bottle with a fancy cap, I don't think that the juice inside is worth as much.
Why do you collect perfume? What is it about perfume that you love?
Fragrances for me is now kind of a lifestyle. In as much as I smell so many fragrances, I'm always curious about what's next. I'm always looking forward to new smells, new every day, because I don't think you can smell enough. And as well, I feel like it's a kind of traveling to places I've never been. It gives me kind of a different perspective other than my own.
That was Miya from Fab Trends by Miya, joining us from the UK. You can find her on Instagram and on YouTube and all manner of other social media platforms. Check out her reviews. They're pretty awesome. Well, folks, I think that about wraps up this part one of our two-part exploration of class and smell. Credits for this episode go out to Maxwell Williams for the snappy title music, People Bubble Beep, Minetta Rogers, and Cameron at Lookout FM. Music featured in this episode is listed on our website at perfumeontheradio.com and is all in the public domain or used within the doctrines of fair use. This episode has been produced by the Institute for Art and Olfaction, and I have been your hostess, Saskia Wilson-Brown. We look forward to presenting the second part of this episode in March, so definitely keep an eye out for that. In the meantime, keep it kind, keep it real, and keep it smelly.
You're listening to Perfume on the Radio.
On Lookout FM.